Welcome to the deep dive.
So you're curious about nattokinase. It's this enzyme, right? Comes from fermented soybeans, kind of weird source, maybe.
Definitely unusual for many people, yeah.
And you've likely heard some buzz about it, maybe as a natural way to help with blood flow. You want the real story fast.
Get straight to the facts.
Exactly. So our mission today, this deep dive, is really about sorting through the science, what's real potential, what's just hype, especially for heart health. We've looked at the research, where it comes from, how it's made, what it might actually do. Okay, let's get into it.
Right. And the backstory is pretty interesting. It all starts with natto. That's a traditional Japanese dish.
Right. Fermented soybeans.
Yeah, cooked soybeans, and they're fermented using a specific bacteria, Bacillus subtilis natto.
Okay.
And you can think of this bacteria like a tiny little worker. During fermentation, it makes nattokinase like its little tool, its molecular scissors, maybe?
Scissors, I like that.
Yeah, to break down the soy protein. But the interesting part is these same scissors seem to work on blood clots, too. Microscopic scissors for blood clots. And it's interesting, wasn't it first thought to be a kinase, like activating things?
That's right. The name is a bit misleading. It was later identified as a protease.
So it cuts proteins, doesn't activate them. And the key thing we're looking at is that fibrinolytic activity. Its power to dissolve blood clots.
That's the core property, exactly. Dissolving fibrin, the mesh in clots.
Okay, so how do they actually get this nattokinase? Is it just scraped out of the natto?
Well, that's one way, the traditional way, extracting it directly from natto. But it's pretty laborious.
Okay.
So the more common way now is lab-based, using cultures of that Bacillus subtilis.
Ah, okay. Growing it specifically.
Exactly. And what's really interesting, especially if you're vegan, is they don't always need soybeans.
Oh.
They can apparently use other nutrient sources, even things like shrimp shell waste, believe it or not, to get the bacteria to produce nattokinase.
Shrimp shells. Wow, that's unexpected. So this natural enzyme can come from some surprising places.
It really can.
So the lab process, how does that work? They take the bacteria.
Right, the Bacillus subtilis natto. They add it to cooked soybeans, usually. Then they incubate it. Need specific conditions, steamy, around 42 degrees Celsius, for maybe 3 to 5 hours.
Like a little sauna for the bacteria.
Pretty much. And that's when the fermentation happens and the enzyme is produced.
Got it. But natto itself, the food, it's more than just the enzyme, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a traditional food in Japan, been around forever. It has a unique reputation.
How so?
Strong smell, definitely. And the texture is kind of slimy with these sticky threads. Some people call it vegetable cheese.
Vegetable cheese.
Okay.
But nutritionally?
It's actually quite impressive. Easy to digest, high in protein, vitamins. And besides nattokinase, it has other enzymes, these things called soy isoflavones, and even probiotic bacteria.
So it's packed with stuff. I've heard it called one of the healthiest foods out there.
Yeah.
Maybe linked to longevity in Japan.
That's the claim, yeah. There's definitely a lot going for it nutritionally. And you can get it different ways now. Well, the traditional sticky form, obviously. But also, freeze-dried, you can add it to things, or even get kits to make it at home.
Interesting. So that brings to the question, eat the natto or just pop a nattokinase pill?
Right. Pros and cons. Supplements give you a precise dose of the enzyme, which is good if you want a specific amount,
Predictable.
Exactly. But with natto, you get that whole package, the other enzymes, the vitamins, the probiotics.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me, the vitamin K2. Natto is loaded with it, right? The MK7 form.
It's actually high, yes.
But wait, vitamin K is involved in clotting?
Yeah.
So how can natto, full of K2, also have blood-thinning effects from nattokinase? Seems like a contradiction.
It does seem counterintuitive, but it's a really key point. Vitamin K is needed for some clotting factors, yes, but K2 also helps activate anti-clotting factors. It's more about regulation, keeping things in balance.
Ah, okay. So it's not just pro-clotting. It helps regulate the whole system.
Precisely. And there was that study, I think 2017, looking at natto consumption in Japan.
Yeah.
It suggested a link between eating more natto and lower risk of stroke and mortality overall. Now, it's correlation, not causation, but interesting.
Definitely. But important reminder, natto is soy. So no-go if you have a soy allergy.
Crucial point, yes. Absolutely off limits then.
So let's zero in on the enzyme itself, nattokinase. How does it actually do what it does? We said it's a protease, it cuts protein.
Right. So think about how your body normally deals with clots. You have an enzyme called plasmin.
Okay.
Plasmin's job is to break down fibrin, that mesh holding a clot together. That process is fibrinolysis.
The cleanup crew.
Exactly. Then you have thrombin, which does the opposite. It helps form the fibrin mesh.
Got it. Builder versus demolisher.
Good analogy. Nattokinase acts more like plasmin. It has fibrinolytic properties itself, so it can directly help dissolve that fibrin mesh.
Okay, so it directly busts clots similar to our own plasmin. Now, the big question a lot of listeners probably have, can I ditch my aspirin or warfarin and just take nattokinase?
Right. And the answer here has to be really clear. Absolutely not without talking to your doctor. Seriously.
So don't self-prescribe.
Definitely not.
If you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe. It really helps support the podcast and lets me keep bringing you more content like this.
Replacing prescribed blood thinners like aspirin, warfarin, Marcumar, any of those, with nattokinase is not advisable on your own. There was a study in rats, 2013, I think.
What did it show?
It suggested nattokinase could prevent clots forming, similar to aspirin. But, and this is a big but, the doses needed were much, much higher than typical supplements, and we just don't know the human equivalent.
Higher doses, unknown human dose.
Okay. And then there's that case study from 2015 that's quite sobering.
Remind us.
It was a patient post-heart valve surgery. They stopped their prescribed warfarin, took nattokinase instead. Their condition actually got worse. They needed a second operation. It really highlights that nattokinase is not a direct replacement for these powerful medications.
Wow. Okay. Crucial warning there. So it's not a replacement med. Where does it fit in then?
It's better viewed, perhaps, as a potential preventative supplement. Something you might consider as part of an overall healthy lifestyle, good diet, stress reduction, exercise, especially if you're not already on blood thinners but maybe have some risk factors.
Right. Preventative, part of a bigger picture. What about taking it with blood thinners? Combining them?
Generally, that's also not recommended.
Why not?
Because you risk thinning the blood too much. Combining nattokinase with things like vitamin K antagonists, heparin, clopidogrel, aspirin, those newer NOACs, it could significantly increase the risk of bleeding, even internal bleeding.
So potentially dangerous.
Potentially, yes. Now, is it theoretically possible a doctor might, under very close supervision, try a low dose of nattokinase alongside a reduced dose of medication? Maybe, but that's a big maybe and absolutely requires strict medical oversight.
Okay, so the bottom line is always talk to your doctor first, especially if you're on any regular medication.
Always. Full stop.
Okay, so warnings aside, the evidence does suggest it has some real biological activity, some blood thinning effects. What are some key studies?
Yeah, there's a fair bit of research across different models. Back in 1990, there was a dog study. They induced clots in leg veins. Nattokinase apparently dissolved them within about 5 hours. Then a 1995 rat study suggested it was better at restoring blood flow in blocked arteries than even plasmin or another enzyme, elastase.
Okay, animal studies showing effects. What about humans?
There was a 2009 human study, looked at healthy volunteers, people considered at risk, and even dialysis patients.
And the results?
After 2 months of taking nattokinase daily, they saw significant drops in levels of certain factors involved in clotting. And importantly, they didn't report observing any significant side effects in that study.
That sounds promising. And you mentioned a 2015 study on just a single dose.
Yes, that was a good one. Double-blind, placebo-controlled in healthy men. A single 2,000 FU dose did a few things.
Like what?
It increased the breakdown products of fibrin and fibrinogen evidence of clot-dissolving activity. It decreased some coagulation factors. And it slightly prolonged clotting time, all still within a normal, healthy range, though.
So measurable effects even from one dose.
Bet.
But there was a conflicting finding too, right? About long-term effects.
Yes. Balance is key here. A 2021 clinical study, quite rigorous, followed people for 3 years. They took 100 milligrams of nattokinase daily.
And the outcome for arteries.
It did not prevent the progression of arteriosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of arteries. So while it might affect clotting factors short term, this longer study suggests it might not halt that underlying artery disease process.
Okay, that's important context. Short-term effects on clotting seem clearer than long-term prevention of artery hardening.
That seems to be a fair summary of those particular findings, yeah.
So stepping back again, if we look at the bigger picture of cardiovascular health, what's the overall vibe from the research?
There was a big international review in 2018. It summarized a whole range of potential benefits they saw suggested by the evidence up to that point.
HSS.
Things like antithrombotic preventing clots, fibrinolytic dissolving clots, potentially lowering blood pressure, antitherosclerotic effects, fighting plaque buildup, maybe lowering lipids, antiplatelet effects, stopping cells sticking together, even hints of neuroprotection.
Wow, that's quite a list.
It is. The researchers who wrote that review seemed quite positive. They called nattokinase sort of unique, having multiple positive actions for cardiovascular health, maybe even better than drugs that just hit one target.
Interesting perspective.
Yeah, and they pointed out it's natural, you can take it orally, it seems relatively safe for many, and potentially cost-effective. Good for prevention and maybe long-term care.
Oh, that sounds quite optimistic. What about blood pressure specifically? We touched on it, but there was that 2016 study.
Right, the randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled one. U.S. participants genetically prone to high blood pressure, maybe not the healthiest lifestyles. They took 100 milligrams a day of vitamin K-free nattokinase. Over 8 weeks, their systolic and diastolic blood pressure dropped by about 3 to 5 points compared to the placebo group, which saw no real change.
Modest but statistically significant drop.
Exactly. But again, remember that 2021 study we mentioned? It found no effect on blood pressure, so the evidence is a bit mixed. Probably not something to rely on solely for hypertension management.
Right. Manage expectations there. Are there other areas beyond the heart and blood vessels where nattokinase is being looked at?
A few tentative explorations. Alzheimer's, for example. There was an in vitro study, 2009, I think.
In a dish, not in people.
Correct. It suggested nattokinase could break down those amyloid protein deposits linked to Alzheimer's. But that's lab bench stuff. A long, long way from knowing if it works in a human brain. No clinical trials yet.
Very preliminary then. What about cholesterol?
Studies haven't really shown much impact there. Even one using a pretty high dose, like 7,000 FU a day for 6 months, didn't find significant changes in cholesterol or triglycerides.
So, probably not a cholesterol buster. Anything else? Cancer.
Again, very early days. Some mouse studies looking at liver cancer suggested potential benefits like increased survival time, less fluid buildup, maybe slower tumor growth. But this is mice. We absolutely need human research before drawing any conclusions about cancer.
Okay, so mostly focused on cardiovascular potential, with other areas being highly speculative right now.
That seems fair, yes.
Let's swing back to vitamin K2. We know Nabo, the food, is full of it. What about the supplements? Do they have K2?
Generally, no, or very little. When they extract the nattokinase enzyme from the fermented soy,
The K2 gets left behind.
mostly, yeah, it stays with the main bulk of the natto. And remember that point about K2 not just being pro-clotting?
It helps regulate coagulation.
Exactly. But for people specifically taking those vitamin K antagonist drugs, like warfarin,
The ones affected by vitamin K intake.
yes. For them, some nattokinase products are specifically made vitamin K-free just to avoid any potential interaction or concern.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. So if someone is looking to buy a nattokinase supplement, what should they look for? How do you pick a good one?
Good question. There are a few things. Look at the dose. 100 milligram providing 2,000 FU per capsule is pretty standard and what's often used in studies.
FU. We'll get back to what that means.
Right. If you're vegan, check the capsule cellulose, not gelatin. Try to avoid unnecessary additives like magnesium stearate, if you're concerned about those.
Origin matter.
Maybe to some, traditionally from Japan, but some are made in Europe, like Germany now. Non-GMO soybeans is another preference for many.
Capsules better than tablets.
Often, yeah.
Yeah.
Usually fewer binders and fillers in capsules. Some brands offer guarantees, but honestly, it's hard for you to tell if it's working subjectively.
Sure. Right.
And we mentioned the vitamin K-free option. One other thing, soy allergies. Some products used to say soy-free, but now avoid that claim because trace amounts might still be present from the fermentation. That's critical if you have a true soy allergy.
Okay, good checklist. You mentioned FU multiple times. FU, what exactly is that?
Right. FU stands for fibrinolytic units. It's basically a measure of the enzyme's activity, how strong it is at breaking down fibrin, that clot protein.
So it's about potency, not just weight.
Exactly. Most supplements you see are standardized to 2,000 FU per capsule, which makes comparing them easier.
And dosage. You said 2,000 FU is typical.
That's the common recommendation, yeah. Usually corresponds to that 100 milligram capsule. Some studies have used higher doses, maybe up to 5,000 FU daily, sometimes split.
But for an individual?
Best advice. Talk to your healthcare provider. They know your health status. If your regular doctor isn't familiar with it, maybe consult a naturopath or a holistic doctor who has experience.
Get expert advice tailored to you. How about taking it once a day? With food?
Generally taken once daily with water. Whether it's best with meals or on an empty stomach, you see different recommendations. Consistency is probably key. Take it the same way each day.
And can you take it long term?
People do. It can be taken continuously or maybe in cycles or just as needed. Again, depends on the reason for taking it and professional advice.
Okay. How does it even get absorbed? It's an enzyme, a protein. Don't proteins usually get broken down in digestion?
That's a very good point. It's a relatively large molecule. But research suggests that nattokinase, or at least active fragments of it, can be absorbed through the gut lining into the bloodstream.
So it survives digestion, at least partly.
It seems so. The capsule dissolves in the intestine, and then it or its active parts can cross the intestinal wall.
What about stomach acid, though? Wouldn't that destroy it first?
Another valid concern. But nattokinase seems to be more resistant to stomach acid than many other enzymes.
Oh, interesting. Tougher than expected.
Apparently so. It allows enough of it to survive that harsh stomach environment and reach the intestine for potential absorption. It's also fairly heat stable, up to around 50 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so it's fairly robust. Let's talk side effects. You mentioned the bleeding risk with other thinners. Anything else?
The bleeding risk is really the main one, the most serious caution. That 2008 case report is a stark reminder the stroke patient who had a brain hemorrhage combining high-dose nattokinase with aspirin.
Right.
So beyond combining it with other thinners, the other key precaution is surgery.
Stop taking it beforehand.
Yes. Standard advice is to stop nattokinase at least a week, maybe 2, before any planned surgery, and that includes dental procedures to minimize any risk of excessive bleeding.
Makes sense. So approach with caution, know the risks. Are there specific situations or conditions where someone might consider using it, thinking preventatively, assuming they're not on thinners and have talked to a doctor?
Well, based on those potential mechanisms and the risk factors for cardiovascular stuff, you could see why people might consider it if they have things like hypertension, obesity, diabetes, maybe varicose veins or hemorrhoids, poor circulation, early arteriosclerosis.
Or a family history.
Or a strong family history of heart disease, yeah. It's also sometimes mentioned anecdotally for conditions where poor circulation might play a role, things like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, muscle cramps, even endometriosis or uterine fibroids perhaps, though the evidence there is much weaker.
And the long flag thing. Preventing DVT.
Ah, yes. There was a study, I think 2003, looking at preventing travel-related thrombosis. They used a combination product, though, with nattokinase and pycnogenol called flight tabs in high-risk travelers. Showed some promise, but it wasn't just nattokinase alone.
Okay, so given all this, is it fair to call nattokinase a natural blood thinner? How accurate is that label?
It's a convenient label. Is it as natural as eating, say, garlic or ginger, which also have mild blood thinning effects? Maybe not, as it's an isolated enzyme. But it is derived from a natural food source. It generally seems to have fewer side effects than pharmaceutical thinners for many people, when used appropriately. And it can be dosed based on its enzymatic activity, the FU. So naturally derived compound with blood thinning potential might be more precise, but natural blood thinner gets the idea across, I suppose.
Okay. Now, something more recent. There's been a lot of talk online, especially since early 2023, about nattokinase and the spike protein from SARS-CoV-2, specifically the one from mRNA vaccines. What's the deal there?
Right. That definitely created some buzz. There's a study, August 2022, that gets cited a lot. It was an in vitro study.
Meaning in a lab dish.
Exactly. Not in a living thing. They basically took cell soup, a lysate containing the spike protein, and added highly concentrated nattokinase. And they saw that the nattokinase broke down the spike protein.
Okay. So it chopped it up with a dish.
Yes. Which, frankly, isn't that surprising. Nattokinase is a protease. Its job is to break down proteins. Spike protein is a protein.
So enzyme eats protein, enzyme breaks down protein.
Pretty much. But, and this is the absolutely critical part, that lab dish result does not mean that taking a nattokinase capsule will effectively find and destroy spike proteins circulating in your body or produced by cells after vaccination.
Why not?
The conditions are completely different. Dose, concentration, getting the enzyme to the right place in the body, the complex environment of a living organism. You simply cannot extrapolate from that in vitro finding to a therapeutic effect in humans. There's no evidence for that currently.
That is a crucial distinction. What happens in a test tube doesn't automatically translate to the human body.
Precisely. Very important to manage expectations based on the actual data.
Okay. So let's wrap this up. If we boil down this whole deep dive, what are the absolute key takeaways about nattokinase?
I'd say, 1, it does seem to have genuine fibrinolytic, clot-dissolving properties based on lab and some human studies. 2, it shows some potential for supporting cardiovascular health, maybe affecting clotting factors. 3, it is definitely not a replacement for prescribed medications, especially blood thinners.
And 4.
And 4, use it cautiously. The risk of bleeding especially if combined with other thinners or before surgery, is real. Always, always talk to your doctor.
That seems to be the recurring theme. Talk to your doctor. The single most important piece of advice.
Absolutely. Before you even think about starting it, have that conversation with a healthcare professional who knows your history and any other meds you're on.
Right. When you think about how complex cardiovascular health is, all the factors involved,
Yeah.
and then you see this research emerging on natural compounds like nattokinase, it does make you wonder, doesn't it?
How so?
Like, what other traditional foods or maybe other enzymes hidden away in nature might hold these kinds of undiscovered benefits for our well-being? And maybe, how can we get better at bridging that gap between traditional knowledge and rigorous science to really understand and harness these things safely and effectively?
That's a fascinating thought to end on. Lots more to explore, potentially.
Definitely something to ponder. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into nattokinase.
If you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe. It really helps support the podcast and lets me keep bringing you more content like this.